I'm Dr. Silva, and welcome to the first video in a new series, one not dedicated to the practice of psychopharmacology, but rather that is going to deal more with philosophical and spiritual matters. So I guess I should say I'm not a certified expert. The state of Texas has not certified me as an expert on some of the topics I'm going to talk about, but they are relevant to mental health. And I like to think that my training, as well as my experience as a human being who's learned from his mistakes and who's contemplated his life and spent a good deal of time introspecting and trying to be mindful, there's just some things, some conclusions that I've drawn and some ideas that I would really like to share. And you can agree with me or you can disagree with me, or at the very least it's food for thought. But I'm hoping that this series will find an audience and that it will stimulate conversations and comments. So today, first video, I want to talk about free will. The free will argument. And I think most people are familiar with it, but I'll just quickly lay it out. The argument is between the determinists, people that believe in determinism, and people that believe in free will. The determinists do not believe that human beings, or that sentient creatures in general, that we have free will, that that's an illusion, that we actually don't make choices, that everything is decided for us by environmental triggers, stimuli in the environment that then act upon our brains, and that we think we're making decisions, but it's really just our brain reacting, and that if you had all the variables, if all the variables were known, you could predict the behavior of that animal to a T. You could predict exactly what that animal was going to choose. And of course, we don't know all the variables. It's too complicated. And so we can't actually, in real world practice, actually make those predictions. But that's the argument, that everything goes back to the level of reflexes and instincts. I mean, think about a reflex. If somebody taps your knee, you're going to have an electrical impulse, a nervous impulse, and it's lightning fast, and it's at the level of the spinal cord. It doesn't even reach consciousness, and your muscles contract and your knee kicks. That's a reflex. An instinct is a little bit more complicated. An instinct is a complex behavior, but it's also programmed into the very structures, neuronal structures, physical structures of your brain and central nervous system. Complicated behavior like mating behaviors, feeding behaviors, and things that all mammals do, for example, but that are not learned behaviors. They're not taught from one generation to the next. They're actually imprinted, programmed into the very DNA. But we're talking about behavior, and not just behavior, but complex behavior. You can think about the mating rituals of insects and migratory patterns of birds that use the Earth's magnetic poles, and they're not consciously making a decision to fly south for the winter and to take a specific route. Monarch butterflies, that one's fascinating, how they fly thousands of miles, these butterflies, and they're very precise in reaching their destination. How do they know what they're doing and what to do? So those are good examples of deterministic behaviors. The people on the free will side of the argument, myself included, believe that it's not an illusion, that our minds, our psyches, are capable of making choices, that it's not all decided for us, and that we can respond in a way that is paradoxical to a given stimulus. So where you would think that we would choose a certain way, that we have the power, the ability to choose otherwise. So one example would be you put your hand over a flame, and of course the impulse is to remove your hand because you're burning yourself, but if you had enough willpower, you could leave your hand there and sustain significant injury. But that's an example of you exerting your will. Now the determinists will come back and they'll say, no, it's still an illusion, because the mind has engaged in this endeavor of mind over matter. If you're trying to prove determinism wrong, if you're trying to prove that there's free will, well, that's just more determinism at work. That's just more experiences that lead to attitudes and thoughts and perceptions that lead to behaviors that are all determined in a cascade that if we had all the variables, we could explain, and you're not choosing anything. It's choosing for you. That even if you see some behavior that appears to be spontaneous and random, for which there's no good explanation, even that is coming from a programmed set of conditions in the brain that are predictable if one had all the information. That would be the deterministic argument. And so I think we can never prove, it's sort of a moot argument because it can never be proven one way or another. But I just want to say that I stand up for the free will side, and the example that I'm going to give, which I think is very compelling and which I've experienced myself, is addiction. I have struggled with addiction since I was a teenager. Substances, just about everyone except for, ironically, alcohol and tobacco, the ones that are legal, and also food. And when you're white-knuckling a relapse, when your body, your being, your whole core is aching to use or to eat or to otherwise behave in a way that would satisfy the dopamine pleasure centers, but you know it's not in your best interest, it's not healthy, you vowed to yourself that you're not going to do it again for whatever reasons, and you are white-knuckling that to me is the perfect example of free will in action. Now again, you can't argue, the deterministic argument is it can't be argued against because they can always come back and say, nope, it's an illusion, it's the way your brain is set up, and even when you resist doing what your brain wants you to do, I mean, I've experienced it, and it's so obvious to me that there's a part of my psyche, and we could boil it down to neurology. We could say there's a part of my brain, the frontal lobe, that knows better and that wants better for myself. And then there's another part of my brain, the ventral tegmental area and other areas that are involved in addiction, in craving, that are very strong, that have some habit loops and some circuitry that just goes crazy at the mere thought of using, to say nothing of having the substance in front of you. There's an argument to say that you have no choice when you grab that piece of pie or that you snort up those lines of cocaine. It's like a person who's suffocating is going to gasp for breath. They have no choice. Or a person who's dying of thirst, who hasn't had water in weeks, and you put a glass of water in front of them, they're going to grab it and drink it if it's the last thing they do, if it kills them. If it's poison, because the thirst is so overpowering. It's a kind of thirst that none of us have ever experienced, and that person has no choice. Do you really have a choice once you reach that point of no return in the context of an addiction? I would be also on the side of saying, no, there is a point of no return where you really don't have any choice. So you got to make your choices before then. But I do believe there is choice, and I do believe there is will that you're exerting. And even if it's just one part of the brain fighting another part of the brain, it's still one part of my psyche that I strongly identify with, that at least the ego strongly identifies with, fighting a more primitive part that doesn't have much to do with thought, but it has more to do with urges. Those urges do lead to feelings which lead to thoughts, but the thought is, I really want to eat that piece of pie, or I really want to have sex with this person, or I really want to use this drug, or whatever the addiction may be, whether it's not being able to pull away from a video game, or not being able to stop shopping at Amazon. But when we struggle, that to me proves that there's a part of me that is free to make a choice. But there are times when the choice is so impossibly difficult that I can't do it. And I think that's why there are so many people who are overweight, who are struggling on diets, because it's one part of the brain fighting another part of the brain, and that other part of the brain that's more primitive, that part usually wins. But anyway, for the record, I believe in free will. I invite discussion, and thank you for tuning in, especially if you're still watching, and maybe next time it'll be better.